asked people about food.
We were very, very unusual in that we occasionally had spaghetti bolognese in my family. That was very, very unusual. And my school friends at the time thought it was the most disgusting thing you could possibly eat. They called it worms. Horrible.
We had a very simple diet. It was mainly vegetarian because meat was very expensive.
My parents paid for me to have school lunches, and I used to miss them a lot of the time because they were so horrible.
Sago pudding. Oh, awful. Yes.
Because at the time we ate a lot of food that had to be made in this country, vegetables in this country, meat in this country. We didn't have food imports from all the year round. So fruit was very seasonal and salad was very seasonal. And I can remember only 1973 when my sister went to New Zealand. She sent us a letter to say that they didn't have any oranges in the country because the boat hadn't come. Whereas nowadays you have it all the year round, don't you?
I can answer that quite easily. There was no such thing as favourite food because everything was on rations. And you got 2 ounces of cheese or so much meat and so on. So you had what was available. Favourites didn't come into it.
We asked people about fashion.
Fashion item? Oh, do you remember Jason King? No, probably all of you remember Jason King, right? And they had those modern pointed collar shirts with different motifs on it. That was my first fashion item I bought. It was about 1960s, something like that.
I think the first thing I ever bought that I clearly remember was a sweater from Austin Reed's that was wool sleeves and it had a suede front to it. I dare say I would hate it now.
Huge flares. They were called loon pants in those days.
Oh, gosh, those flares? Yes, do you know those flare jeans?
Yeah.
Yes, I guess. So I do remember those, yes, and floppy shirts. Do you remember those floppy shirts?
Yeah.
Yeah, long hair, yes.
They were very simple clothes. They were very A-line, so they went straight down, and then they had colours, different colours, so that maybe black or white, and they would have black dresses and then a white patch round here or down at the bottom, and they were very short.
Because, well, yeah, you had to look good, didn't you, in those days? You was either muds or rockers in those sort of days. But those little brownish stripes, white shirt, brownish stripes, with those big, long, pointed collars. You know, about twice as long as this. Oh, it was fantastic.
He had long hair too.
Had long hair in those days.
We asked people about their leisure time.
I played football, or we went camping, or we'd go to, we'd just walk for maybe 10 miles some days, really, with a group of us. That's about it. I can't really think. Cricket in the summer, swimming, not much changed really, I suppose.
When I was 10, playing outside in fields and making dens.
Similar, yeah. It's in the common, on the Cleo.
We asked people about travel.
So he had a little car. Probably a little old Austin. Do you remember that? No, you probably wouldn't know that. No, you wouldn't know that. I forget the number of the Austin, but it was very tiny. It was 2 little doors that used to open the opposite way cars open now. You know, the technology now is, the technology in a car is phenomenal. When you think about modern cars, all the sensors, right, and the quality of the materials, they've improved way, way beyond what they were like in the 1950s and 60s.
We asked people about school.
I can remember in my junior school learning, for instance, the multiplication tables, which I still know, obviously, completely off by heart. I can remember having to learn. A great deal more was actually committed to memory than is committed to memory now.
Favourite lesson at school? Oh, art, definitely art. Yes, yes. I used to love drawing and painting, even though I've just retired, actually. I became a scientist, actually, but I used to like drawing and painting better when I was a kid.
I can remember, because I saw a photograph of her the other day, because I found an old school photograph of a woman called Miss Evans, who I didn't like very much. I can remember, on the other hand, a nice man when I was in the sort of fifth form of my junior school called Mr. Chislett, who realized I liked acting and the theatre very much. So he let me put on plays on Friday afternoons when we could do anything we liked in school.
My Latin teacher was very keen on cricket. He was a good sportsman, right? And I used to play cricket for the team, you know, for the school. So our first lesson on a Monday morning was Latin usually, all right? And instead of doing Latin for 40 minutes, we used to talk about cricket.
We asked people about technology.
Technology that I used a Hoover, so that's a piece of technology. And I used all the household equipment, and sewing machine was my best friend.
There was no such thing as an iPod. There was no such thing as MP3 players. There was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as digital downloads. There were no CDs. There were no DVDs. Nothing like that at all. So what I had, music was records or the radio. There was television. That was a big part of my childhood, watching television. I watched the very first episode ever of Doctor Who. I can remember that. In 1963 when it started.
We had a television to watch the coronation in 1953, and it was black and white and small. And that was it. And there was only one channel on the television, the BBC.
When I lived in Cardiff, a phone was very difficult to get. There was only one phone company, as you'll probably remember. The phone that we used was our next door neighbours they had a phone. I can even remember their telephone number now. It was Rubina 865, and we didn't have a phone until we moved to the Midlands in about 1952, I suppose. Then we had a telephone.
No. We had one in the household, but we didn't have such things as mobile phones. We had an old dial-up telephone, that kind of thing, that you see in junk shops now. So if I wanted to use the phone, I had to get a stool and stand on it. There's such thing as health and safety in those days.
We had a phone, a big black phone at home, we just used that normally. When we were at boarding school, we weren't allowed to ring up home at all. We went to school for 12 weeks, and you weren't allowed to go home in that time when I was 10/11. And you only were able to speak to in my case, my mother, in an emergency. And they very, very, very rarely happened.
There was no TV when I was very young. We didn't have a TV as it, gosh, I must have been a teenager before we had TV. Yeah, but we had radios, and the radios were valves, you know, the valve radios. Of course, the valves used to break quite frequently. Yes. So that was the main technology in the home.
We asked people about immigration.
Yeah, well, I lived in Cardiff as a small boy when I was younger than you. By the time I was roughly your age, I'd left Cardiff. But Cardiff was a port. It had been the most important coal port in the world. So I was quite used to seeing around, for instance, Chinese people in a Chinese laundry, Chinese people speaking with a Welsh accent when they spoke English. And clearly I can remember seeing black people simply because I lived during the war, and there were a large number of American soldiers, a large number of whom were black. And also there was a large black community living in Cardiff at the time.
When I was 14, I went to stay with a family in Germany who had a son who was about my age. Wolf's father had been a prisoner of war in this country in 1945 And that's when he got to know my father. So I went to stay with them, and nearly 54 years later, I was talking this week to the son of my friend who rang us from Germany.
I think I must have been about 4 or 5, and my grandparents knew a West Indian, and he appeared one day in our house, or my grandmother's house actually, because we were living with my grandmother, and I remember being quite shocked actually at the time, because yes, to see somebody that was completely different to everybody else around.
I've always known people from foreign countries, because I was lucky enough to spend all my holidays in Scotland in a big house, and there were always people from India, Africa, and all over the world, America, so I met people from all over the place.
The first one I ever saw was when I was at my nan's, and a coloured man with a turban on his head came round knocking at the door, and we had to hide because we hadn't seen anyone like that before, and she was frightened to death. That was the first one.
We asked people about shopping.
Woolworths was a very popular shop, so you know that would be a shop for getting reasonable quality stuff at a reasonable price, toys and things. Yeah.
It was a grocer's shop. I used to go with my mother every Friday and buy the groceries that we could get at that time. A bit few and far between.
Oh, crikey. Woolworths, probably. Because you could go into Woolworths and buy all sorts of lovely toys and sweets. So yes, I think it was probably Woolworths.
I was very lucky actually. I had an aunt who used to dote on me. She was really, one of those. So every time we used to go down the road, as they called it in Liverpool, we used to go on the road. Yes. She used to buy me a dinky toy. I remember that very well. Almost every time we went out. I was a very lucky boy.